Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Every single Canadian wants one thing in life, or amongst one thing in life, to have nutritious, sustainable, and affordable food produced right here in Canada. But the Prime Minister's carbon tax coalition with the NDP is making that almost impossible for Canadian farmers and for Canadian consumers. The Parliamentary Budget Officer was very clear. Bill C-234, which we are trying to pass through the Senate, would save Canadian farmers close to $1 billion by 2030. $1 billion. This is not insignificant costs that we are talking about that Canadian farmers are trying to absorb. When we are seeing farmers struggle with higher input costs, higher interest rates, and again, paying their carbon tax again and again and again. This is reality. But there are consequences to this reality which seems to be lost on the Liberal government. 800,000 Ontarians made close to 6 million visits to the food bank last year, an increase of almost 40%, the highest single-year increase ever recorded. I want that to sink in. 800,000 people in Ontario alone had to go to a food bank last year because they can't afford to feed their families. The Liberals will say every single question period, oh, the Conservatives, all they're going to do is cut, cut, cut. Well, the cutting that is happening right now is Canadian families cutting meals for their kids. Canadian families having to cut the heat down at night and put a sweater or a blanket on because they can't afford to heat their homes. These are the cuts that are happening every single day by Canadians who are having to face extremely difficult choices. Either feed my family or heat my home. These are not choices that should be made in a country like Canada. But that is exactly what ideological activist agenda by the Liberal-NDP government is forcing Canadians to do. Now we have a common sense Conservative bill, Bill C-234, that will help reduce costs for farmers and make food more affordable for Canadians. But the Liberal government is going out of their way to bully senators in the Senate to block 234. This is disrespectful to this House of Commons. The House of Commons that is elected by the people to represent our constituents. This House, by a very strong majority, in fact, every single opposition party in this House supported Bill 234. Because every opposition party in this House understands the importance of Canadian agriculture. Every member of the official opposition understands the importance of ensuring that Canadians have affordable food to put on their table. Affordable food that's produced right here in Canada by Canadian farmers, ranchers, and producers. But what we are seeing is the Liberals play games with the Senate. Disrespecting, as I said, disrespecting the decisions made by this House of Commons. And I know my colleague from Wellington, Halton Hills has talked about this a great deal, the fact that this is a taxation bill that was passed by this House. The Senate does not have the jurisdiction or the authority to override a taxation bill decided upon by the House of Commons. And yet that's exactly what's happening. The Senate is playing games with the livelihoods of Canadian farmers, playing games with the lives of Canadian families who are struggling to put food on the table. Food should not be a luxury, and it should certainly not be a plaything in the political gamesmanship of the Liberal government. But I want to take a moment, Madam Speaker, just to talk about the real-life consequences that this is having on Canadian farmers. I had a phone call from a dairy farmer 2 weeks ago who is basically in tears. She has come to the conclusion that she knows this is going to happen. She's going to lose her farm by Christmas to bankruptcy. She has a number of loans on her farm, as every single farmer does. They have lots of assets, but a lot of debt. Her interest rate on her debt went from 1.9% to 7.2%. Wow. She can no longer afford the interest payments. But on top of that, her carbon tax and fuel bills have doubled over the last year, making it impossible for her to maintain her operation. That is yet another lost farm for Canadian farmers, lost jobs, but lost production and lost yields. A mushroom farmer from Ontario sent me this note. His carbon tax went up last year, and he was going to be paying $173,000 in carbon taxes alone. And when it goes up in 2030, his carbon tax bill will be $450,000 a year. How is that economically sustainable? I'll tell you, it is not. This government talks about economics or environment sustainability all the time, but they never talk about economic viability. And that is the most important element, because you can't be environmentally sustainable if you no longer exist. But his quote, "It is difficult to see how our farm, or any farm, will remain in business if this continues. It will be unsustainable for our next generation to take on our farms, killing the food chain within Canada. This is not fair to farmers, families, or the farming generations to come. And it is not fair to Canadian consumers who want to eat food grown in Canada, which has a lower carbon footprint." Another letter from a poultry farmer in Alberta. Last year, he paid $120,000 in carbon taxes. This year, he's paying $180,000. By 2030, his carbon tax bills will be $480,000 a year. We are a chicken business and just simply can't afford the crippling carbon tax. If this is allowed to continue and go to $170 a ton, we will need to shut down. The tax we pay is not going to do anything to eliminate carbon emissions. Our best hope is that we increase our selling price to the consumer to recover these costs, which is the last thing you or I want to see in these inflationary times. So we are seeing record high food inflation in Canada as a result of farmers paying the carbon tax again and again and again. Not only do they pay it when they are heating and cooling their barns or drying their grain, they are paying it when they buy fertilizer. They are paying it when they buy seed. They are paying it when they buy chemicals. They are paying it again when they transport their grain or their cattle. They're paying it again when the rail line sends them their bill for moving their grain to port. There is very few other industries that I can think of, Madam Speaker, that pay their carbon tax more than Canadian farmers. And yet, they're dedicated to the job that they do, and they are dedicated to always finding better ways and new innovations to reduce their emissions. But that is not taken into consideration whatsoever with bills that are being blocked by the Liberals. I have a military veteran who retired from the military and moved to Saskatchewan. And he said in 2020, his fuel bill was $7,000. In 2021, $9,000. In 2022, it's now $12,000. He said, "The weird part is I drive my machinery the same amount and the same number of hours each year. His land is the same size, which means taxes are making up the difference in costs. I'm only farming a half section and I'm farming organically. If I didn't, I would be broke by now." These are stories that we are getting in our office every single day, Madam Speaker. And these are the real life consequences of the carbon tax and the impact it's having on farmers. But the consequence of that, Madam Speaker, is it's increasing the cost of food that Canadians are having to deal with every single day. So when you increase the costs and carbon tax on farmers who are growing the food, you're increasing the taxes on the truckers who are moving the food, you are increasing the costs on carbon on processors who are manufacturing the food, retailers who are selling the food. Do you know what happens, Madam Speaker? Food becomes unaffordable for the Canadian consumer. And that's why we're seeing 1 in 5 Canadians skipping meals. That's why you're seeing record-breaking numbers at food banks. And this is not lost across Canada. We have letters from 5 premiers that are asking the Senate to pass this bill. Premiers across Canada understand the importance of this legislation. Saskatchewan, Alberta, Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick are begging the Senate to do their job, respect the will of the House of Commons, and pass this legislation. Hear, hear. But we have the Environment Minister, the Prime Minister's Environment Minister, threatening to resign if this bill is passed. He said no more carbon tax carve-outs. This comes days after the Prime Minister already admitted that his carbon tax is unaffordable and had a carve-out for home heating oil. This is clearly common sense legislation, Madam Speaker. This will make food more affordable, but the most important thing is Canadians want nutritious, sustainable, affordable food produced by Canadian farmers, So 234 will make that a reality.
Here, here.